They laughed at him. An old man in worn boots, standing among millionaires, daring to raise his hand at the grandest horse auction in Kentucky. To the crowd, it was a joke, until the stallion looked into his eyes and the auctioneer's hammer fell. That night, ridicule turned to silence, and whispers of a forgotten legend returned. What happened next would shake the racing world forever. The autumn air in Lexington carried a sharp edge, a mix of wood smoke from distant farms and the sweet tang of bourbon drifting from polished glasses. The grand courtyard of the auction house glowed under strings of golden lights, where men in tailored suits and women in velvet dresses moved like pieces on a gilded chessboard. Laughter rose and fell with the clink of crystal, boots polished to mirrors clicked against the cobblestones, and the scent of oiled leather mingled with perfume worth more than a farmhand's year of wages. It was the kind of night designed to remind the world who held power, who could buy beauty, and who had the privilege to shape destiny with a raised paddle. Amidst the wealth and ceremony, one figure drew glances, not because he fit in, but because he didn't. Samuel Walker, known to few and forgotten by most, stepped into the light. His coat was weathered, more brown than black after years of sun and rain. The brim of his hat was bent and scuffed, boots caked with Kentucky mud that no shine could hide. His stride was slow, deliberate, the kind of walk of a man who had nothing to prove but carried the weight of something unseen. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few smirked openly. Others whispered behind raised hands. Who had let a farmhand into a gathering of millionaires? Richard Kane, a young tycoon with a jaw as sharp as his arrogance, leaned toward his companion, Elliot Grant. "Looks like the stable boy wandered in," he muttered, his grin cutting as he lifted a glass of amber whiskey. Elliot, who thrived on other people's humiliation, chuckled low. "Maybe he's here to muck the stalls." Sam heard the laughter, but did not flinch. His gray eyes moved over the rows of horses being paraded under the auctioneer's spotlight, studying each with the quiet intensity of a craftsman examining his tools. He noticed more than the sheen of a polished coat, or the carefully braided mane. He watched how a horse shifted its weight, how its ears flicked when the crowd roared, how its breath fogged in the cold, and whether it trembled or stood still. To him, these were not commodities. They were living, breathing partners. The auctioneer's voice thundered across the courtyard, announcing bloodlines and records, tossing out numbers so high they drew gasps and excitement. Paddles shot into the air, each bid a declaration of wealth and dominance. Deals were sealed with a nod, fortunes spent as casually as tipping a waiter. Yet Sam stood with his arms folded, eyes steady, waiting. When the gates swung open for the next lot, silence fell for a moment. A stallion stepped into the ring, black as midnight yet glinting with silver under the lights, its muscles rippling with restrained power. Its mane flowed like a storm cloud caught in the wind. Even the wealthiest among them leaned forward, breaths caught. "Lot number 31, the auctioneer boomed. "Midnight Star, sired by champions, born to rule the track. Bidding begins at $1 million. The first paddle rose without hesitation. Another followed, then another. Voices swelled, the air thick with competition. Richard Kane lifted his own paddle, smirking as though the stallion was already his. But then, from the back of the room, another hand went up. A hush spread. Heads turned. It was Samuel Walker. For a heartbeat, the room seemed stunned into disbelief. Then laughter erupted like a crack in glass. "Him?" Elliot barked. "He couldn't buy the nails in that horse's shoes." Richard's laughter was louder, crueler. Maybe he found a jar of pennies under the porch. But Sam didn't laugh. He didn't shift. He didn't explain. His hand remained raised until the auctioneer's gaze found him. With a quiet certainty, Sam lowered his arm and reached into his coat. From it, he pulled a folded check. The paper looked almost too ordinary to carry the weight of a moment like this. He passed it to an assistant who brought it forward. The auctioneer glanced down, almost dismissively at first. Then he froze. His throat caught. He read the numbers again, and then the name scrawled across the bottom. His eyes widened. For the second time that night, the crowd fell silent. The laughter choked in their throats. They knew that name. Some too young to remember whispered it like a rumor. Others, older and seasoned, felt a chill of recognition. Samuel Walker, the trainer who once forged legends on the racetrack, who vanished years ago without a word. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he raised the gavel. "Sold. To Mr. Samuel Walker." The gavel struck wood, sharp as a gunshot. Midnight Star pawed the ground, his dark eyes flicking toward the man in the battered hat. And in that instant, something shifted in the courtyard. The laughter of the wealthy had turned to silence, and what stood in its place was something rarer, something none of them had expected. Respect, or perhaps fear. The silence that followed the auctioneer's words felt heavier than the Kentucky night air. For one fragile moment, no one moved. No one breathed, as if the whole courtyard had been caught in the stallion's shadow. Then, like a storm breaking across the horizon, the laughter returned, louder, sharper, cutting through the hush with cruel delight. "Impossible!" Elliot Grant's voice rose above the din, thick with disbelief. He leaned forward, his jeweled cufflinks glinting under the lights. "That old fool couldn't scrape together the price of hay, let alone write a check like that." His words spread like fire, and soon the courtyard buzzed with mockery. Some shook their heads, others whispered that the check must be fake, that the auctioneer had been duped. Richard Kane didn't laugh this time. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Instead, it curved with the precision of a knife blade. He stepped closer, his boots echoing against the cobblestones, each stride measured and heavy with disdain. "Samuel Walker," he drawled, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "I thought you were dead, or worse, forgotten. And now here you are, trying to buy your way back into a world that moved on without you." Sam didn't answer. He stood as still as the stallion beside him, the brim of his battered hat casting his eyes into shadow. Midnight Star flicked his ears, restless at the sound of raised voices, but Sam's hand moved, calm and steady, brushing along the horse's neck. The animal stilled, as if the man's touch anchored him against the storm of ridicule. The crowd surged closer, curious to witness the spectacle. A few younger breeders snickered openly, jostling each other with sly grins. "Look at him," one whispered, dressed like a stable hand, trying to play king. Another added, "He probably mortgaged his shack for this stunt. Poor fool doesn't know what he's gotten into." The auctioneer, still pale from the shock of the check in his hands, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling. "The sale is final. The stallion belongs to Mr. Walker." The announcement only stoked the fire. Elliot barked a laugh, raising his glass as though toasting the absurdity of it all. "To Samuel Walker. May his horse eat better than he does." The men around him roared, clinking their glasses in cruel harmony. Richard, however, kept his gaze locked on Sam. His smirk widened, but his voice lowered, dripping with venom meant only for the man who had dared humiliate him. "You think this proves something? A check, a name pulled from the dust of old newspapers? That horse will be nothing more than a pretty ornament in your crumbling life. You can't bring back the past, Walker, and you sure as hell can't outrun me." Sam finally raised his eyes, gray and unyielding, meeting Richard's with a calmness that unsettled more than anger ever could. "A good horse," he said quietly, almost like a prayer, "doesn't care about your money. He cares about who he trusts." The words seemed simple, almost too simple, yet they landed with a weight that silenced even a few of the jeering voices. Midnight Star shifted closer to Sam, his powerful body brushing against the man's shoulder, as if confirming the truth in those words. But Richard was not a man to be silenced. His pride burned hotter than the bourbon in his veins. He lifted his chin, turning so the whole courtyard could hear. "If you think you still have what it takes, old man, prove it. I'll put Thunderbolt against your Midnight Star. 1 week from today, Churchill Downs. Winner takes the glory. Loser leaves with nothing but shame." The crowd gasped. The challenge wasn't just a race. It was a public execution masked as entertainment. Thunderbolt was a legend, a stallion bred with care and money, undefeated on the track. Midnight Star was a mystery, an untested shadow in the world of champions. To pit them against each other was madness. Elliot laughed again, raising his drink high. "Yes, let's see it. The fallen legend against the king of the track. What better show for Kentucky's finest?" The courtyard erupted in approval, cheers and jeers blending into a feverish roar. Bets were already being whispered, odds calculated, reputations wagered like chips at a poker table. Sam didn't flinch. He turned, running his weathered hand once more along the length of Midnight Star's neck. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his coat, but his eyes were calm, steady, locked on the man who held his lead. Sam looked back at Richard, his voice low but clear enough to carry over the din. 1 week, he said, and when that day comes, we'll see which of us is chasing the other's shadow. A hush fell again, brief but unmistakable. For all their wealth, all their certainty, the men and women gathered felt a flicker of doubt. Samuel Walker had spoken not like a man broken by years of obscurity, but like one who had been waiting for this very moment. The laughter had returned with sharp edges, but beneath it, unease lingered. Midnight Star tossed his head, his mane glinting under the lights, and for the first time, even Richard Kane felt something he hadn't expected. A tremor of fear. The night after the auction, the lights of the courtyard had long since dimmed, but the whispers had not faded. In every parlor and smoke-filled lounge of Lexington, Samuel Walker's name was spoken with a mixture of derision and uneasy fascination. The younger generation laughed at the idea that an aging man in worn boots could possibly matter in their world of wealth and prestige. Yet among the older horsemen, those whose eyes still held the glint of remembered races, there was something else. A recognition, a shiver of memory that pulled them back decades. Sam's name had once been carved into the heart of Kentucky racing. Long before his coat had turned threadbare and his hands had grown knotted with age, He had been a trainer who saw horses not as property, but as partners. The stories still lingered like ghosts. The way he had turned a nervous colt into a champion, how his horses ran not only with muscle, but with fire, as though his belief in them had seeped into their very bones. At the edge of the auction grounds, away from the laughter and bourbon, Sam leaned against the stall door of Midnight Star. The stallion stood tall, eyes gleaming like coals in the dim lantern light. Sam reached out, resting a steady hand on the animal's muzzle. For a moment, his mind slipped away from the present and into the heavy vault of memory. He saw another horse, years ago, thundering down a track under the burning Kentucky sun. Its name was Iron Will, the colt that had carried Sam into the realm of legends. Crowds had risen to their feet, roaring his name, newspapers printing headlines that crowned him the Horse Whisperer of the South. He remembered the feel of the dirt vibrating under his boots, the smell of sweat and leather, the rush of victory. But with those memories came others, darker ones that clung like shadows. The accident. A boy too young, too reckless, eager to prove himself. His own son, Matthew, thrown from a horse during a trial run. Sam had watched helplessly as the life bled out of the boy's dreams. And with it, something inside him broke. That day, he walked away from the racetrack and never looked back. His name faded from the papers, his victories became footnotes, and in their place grew a silence no applause could ever fill. Forgotten, Richard Kane had sneered earlier that night, and perhaps, for a time, it had been true. Sam had let himself fade, burying his grief beneath years of solitude. But as he stroked the powerful neck of Midnight Star, feeling the stallion's steady breath against his hand, he wondered if fate had finally circled back, if this horse had been sent to remind him of who he once was, and who he still might be. Behind him, footsteps crunched against gravel. The voice that followed was sly, tinged with false sweetness. "Walker," Elliot Grant called, his shadow stretching long in the lantern glow. "Quite the spectacle you made tonight. The city will be buzzing for weeks." He stepped closer, swirling the last of his whiskey in a crystal glass. "But you do know, don't you? They're not laughing because they think you're brave. They're laughing because they think you've lost your mind." Sam didn't turn. His hand never left the stallion. "Let them laugh," he said quietly. Elliot chuckled, sipping his drink. "You don't really believe you can win against Thunderbolt, do you? That horse is a machine. Bred for speed, trained by the best money can buy. Richard didn't challenge you to give you glory, old man. He challenged you to bury you. 1 week from now, they'll be laughing harder than they are tonight." Finally, Sam turned, his gray eyes steady under the brim of his hat. "I don't need them to believe," he said. "The horse believes. That's enough." Elliot studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "We'll see." With that, he melted back into the night, his laughter echoing down the path. When he was gone, Sam exhaled slowly, pressing his forehead briefly against Midnight Star's. The horse's ear flicked, nostrils flaring, as if sensing the storm that was coming. Sam whispered, almost to himself, "They've forgotten what it means to see a horse for what he is. We'll remind them." The stallion shifted, pawing the ground once before settling again, his dark eyes locked on Sam's. There was a bond there, fragile yet unshakable, the beginning of something neither the crowd nor the millionaires could measure with money. Far across town, in a mansion lined with marble and mahogany, Richard Kane poured himself another drink. His laughter from earlier had faded, leaving behind a simmering edge of irritation. He remembered the stillness in the courtyard when Sam spoke, the way Midnight Star had chosen him without hesitation. For a man so certain of his dominance, that moment lingered like a thorn under his skin. He turned to the window, where Thunderbolt stood under the glow of floodlights in his private paddock. The gray stallion's coat shimmered like steel, his breath rising in clouds against the night air. "You'll crush him," Richard muttered, "and the world will see the difference between legends of the past and power of the present." But deep down, though he would never admit it, there was something in Samuel Walker's eyes that unsettled him more than he cared to acknowledge. The week ahead would not only test the mettle of two horses, but it would decide whether a forgotten man could reclaim his place, or prove the world right in mocking him. And as the night deepened, whispers of the challenge spread beyond Lexington, rolling like thunder across Kentucky. Samuel Walker's name was back on people's lips, no longer a ghost, but a question. Could the legend rise again? Morning sunlight washed over the rolling hills of Kentucky, painting the grass in shades of emerald and gold. The air smelled of damp earth and hay, the familiar perfume of the land that had raised champions and broken men alike. Samuel Walker stood in the pasture with Midnight Star, the stallion's black coat glistening with dew. There were no crowds here, no jeering voices or clinking glasses, just the whisper of the wind and the sound of a restless horse shifting his weight, muscles rippling like currents under his skin. Sam loosened the lead rope and stepped back, his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. Midnight Star tossed his head, ears flicking at the sudden freedom. For a moment, the stallion stood still, as though testing the air, then surged forward in a burst of raw power. His hooves thundered against the earth, a sound that echoed through the valley and stirred something in Sam's chest. He watched quietly, arms crossed, the brim of his old hat casting his eyes in shadow. This was not training in the traditional sense. He wasn't interested in forcing the stallion into form or breaking his will with ropes and whips. He wanted to see what lay beneath, the fire, the instinct, the spirit no pedigree could measure. And as Midnight Star galloped in wide arcs across the pasture, Sam saw more than speed. He saw hunger. When the stallion slowed, snorting clouds of steam into the cool air, Sam gave a small gesture, barely a tilt of his body. Midnight Star hesitated, ears pricked, then turned toward him. Step by step, the horse closed the distance until his breath warmed the man's hand. Sam touched his muzzle gently, nodding to himself. It wasn't perfect, not yet. But it was the beginning of trust. A rustle behind the fence drew Sam's attention. Emily stood there, her long hair tied back, her hands gripping the wooden rails. She had been watching silently, her eyes wide with something between awe and longing. When Sam looked her way, she straightened quickly. "You didn't tell me you were bringing him here," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and reproach. Sam shrugged. "Didn't know I would until I did." Emily climbed over the fence, landing lightly in the grass. Midnight Star snorted at her sudden movement, but Sam's steady hand calmed him. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on the horse. "He's beautiful," she whispered, as though afraid speaking too loud might shatter the spell. Sam studied her carefully. "Beauty won't win a race. Heart will." Emily reached out tentatively. Midnight Star's ears flicked, nostrils flaring, but he didn't shy away. When her hand brushed his neck, her face lit with wonder. For a fleeting moment, Sam saw something familiar in her eyes. The same fire that had once burned in his son's before the accident had stolen it away. He turned away, the memory sharp, but Emily's voice pulled him back. He trusts you. I can see it. It's like there's an invisible thread between you. Sam didn't answer. Words weren't his way, but in his heart, he knew she was right. Trust wasn't taught in a week. It wasn't bought with money or forged with force. It was earned quietly, day by day. And in this stallion, he felt the beginnings of a bond that reached deeper than anything the millionaires at the auction could ever understand. Later that day, Richard Kane arrived at Churchill Downs for his own private training session. Thunderbolt, his gray stallion, stood regal beneath the floodlights, every muscle honed to perfection. Trainers barked orders, stable hands bustled, and the air smelled of sweat and liniment. Richard watched with a satisfied smirk as Thunderbolt completed lap after lap with machine-like precision. "That's how a champion looks," he told Elliot Grant, who lounged nearby with a drink in hand. "Not some wild horse from a washed-up trainer's pasture." Elliot chuckled, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Still," he said, swirling his glass, "the way Walker handled that stallion at the auction, it was more than a show. It unsettled people." Richard scoffed. "People love a story, a fallen hero, a dramatic return. But when the gates open next week, all that nonsense will vanish. Thunderbolt will win, and Walker will fade back into obscurity where he belongs." Back at the pasture, night settled in. Emily lingered by the fence, unwilling to leave. Midnight Star stood calm beside Sam, the stallion's breathing steady now after his run. The two seemed to share a silence, a communion without words. Emily broke it softly. "Do you really think he can beat Thunderbolt?" she asked. Sam looked at her, his face lined with years of sorrow and resolve. "I don't think," he said slowly. "I know. Because Thunderbolt runs for the crowd, Midnight Star runs for me." Emily's breath caught at the certainty in his tone. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just about a race. It was about redemption. It was about proving that heart, trust, and the invisible bond between man and horse could outshine all the money and arrogance in the world. As the moon rose high above the Kentucky hills, Samuel Walker tipped his hat, his hand resting on Midnight Star's strong neck. The journey had only begun, but already the threads of destiny were pulling tight, weaving man and stallion together into something no one else could see. Yet. The news of the challenge spread faster than wildfire across Kentucky. By dawn the next day, the story had already reached every barn, diner, and betting parlor in Lexington. "The washed-up Samuel Walker against Richard Kane's Thunderbolt," they whispered, some with mockery, some with awe. Old men at the feed store shook their heads, saying Sam had lost his mind. Young jockeys snickered over morning coffee, betting that the race would be over before it began. Yet beneath the laughter, a current of excitement pulsed, because nothing thrilled Kentucky more than a battle between pride and destiny. Sam felt the weight of those whispers as he saddled Midnight Star in the quiet of his pasture. The stallion shifted restlessly, nostrils flaring at the scents of hay and morning dew. Emily hovered nearby, her eyes bright with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. She had heard the gossip too, but what burned in her chest wasn't doubt. It was urgency. "They're saying you can't do it," she blurted out. "They think you're going to humiliate yourself." Sam tightened the girth strap, his weathered hands steady. "That's their fire," he said calmly. "It burns quick and bright. Ours burns slow and steady." Emily frowned. "But Richard Kane isn't just another man, Uncle Sam. He's powerful. Everyone listens to him. And Thunderbolt, he's not just a horse, he's a machine. Trained, perfect, undefeated. Sam lifted his gaze, the lines around his eyes deepening. Machines don't have hearts. Horses do. He patted Midnight Star's flank, and the stallion snorted as if in agreement. Later that afternoon, a group of journalists arrived uninvited at Sam's pasture. They crowded the fence, their cameras flashing, pens scratching furiously in notebooks. "Mr. Walker," one shouted. "Why come back now after all these years?" Another barked, "Do you really believe this horse can defeat Thunderbolt?" Sam ignored them at first, leading Midnight Star through a series of calm exercises, letting the stallion's power speak for itself. Finally, he turned, his voice measured but firm. "You all want a story about money, about spectacle. But this race isn't about that. It's about heart. You'll see it when the time comes." The reporters exchanged glances. Some scoffed, others scribbled faster, sensing that there was something more beneath his words. The next morning, headlines blared across Kentucky. "Walker returns, a fool's gamble, or a legend's last stand." Meanwhile, Richard Kane was thriving on the attention. In his marble-floored mansion, he hosted a party that very night, pouring bourbon into crystal glasses as investors and breeders toasted his inevitable victory. "He's walking straight into his own funeral," Richard boasted, the crowd roaring with laughter. Elliot Grant leaned against the bar, grinning smugly. "And we'll all have front-row seats when Thunderbolt buries his legend." But not everyone in the room laughed. A retired trainer, his hair gone white, leaned toward another old-timer. "Don't underestimate Walker," he muttered. "I've seen what he can do with a horse. If anyone can pull off a miracle, it's him." His companion only shook his head, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Back at the pasture, the fire of the challenge burned brighter with each passing hour. Sam pushed Midnight Star harder, testing his limits, letting him stretch across the fields until his black coat gleamed with sweat, and his breath came in clouds. Emily watched every movement, her heart thundering in time with the horse's hooves. She longed to be a part of it, to help, but Sam held back, his silence heavy with memories he couldn't yet share. That night, Emily found him sitting alone on the porch, the lantern casting long shadows across his weathered face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Is it just about proving them wrong?" Sam's gaze drifted to the dark outline of Midnight Star grazing under the moonlight. "It's not about them," he said finally. "It's about him. And it's about me. Some fires never die, Emily. They just wait for the right wind to bring them back to life." Her chest tightened at the weight of his words. She didn't fully understand, but she knew this was bigger than a race. It was redemption, rebirth, and reckoning all tangled into one. In the days that followed, more strangers gathered by the fence to watch, some cheering, some jeering. Midnight Star's strides grew longer, his responses sharper, his trust in Sam deepening with every silent cue. Still, doubts lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. Could 1 week of training truly forge a champion strong enough to face Thunderbolt? Sam never voiced his fears, but he carried them in the tightness of his jaw, in the long hours he spent walking the pasture alone, whispering to ghosts only he could hear. And yet, when he returned, to the stallion's side, his hands were steady, his voice calm, as though he were shaping not just a horse, but destiny itself. The fire of the challenge had been lit. It burned in the whispers of the town, in the arrogance of Richard Kane, in the determination of Samuel Walker, and in the pounding heart of Midnight Star. And soon it would blaze across the track at Churchill Downs, where the world would watch and decide whether it consumed him or crowned him once more. The next morning dawned clear, the Kentucky sky painted with streaks of rose and amber. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of wet grass and distant wood smoke. Samuel Walker was already in the pasture when Emily came out of the house, her boots crunching against the gravel path. Midnight Star stood tethered loosely nearby, his black coat shimmering in the light, his muscles restless with energy. Emily had grown up surrounded by horses, yet she had never seen one quite like this. Midnight Star seemed more than flesh and bone. He moved with a wild grace that carried both danger and beauty, like a storm contained in a single body. She stopped short, watching as Sam brushed the stallion's mane with slow, methodical strokes, his weathered hand firm and sure. "Morning," she said softly, as though afraid her voice might disturb the fragile stillness. Sam looked up, giving her a brief nod before returning to his work. Emily hesitated, then stepped closer. "He's different," she said. "It's like he knows something the others don't." Sam's lips curved faintly. "He knows himself. That's more than most men can say." Emily reached out, her hand trembling just slightly. Midnight Star's ears flicked toward her, his nostrils flaring. For a moment, she thought he might shy away, but instead he lowered his head, allowing her palm to rest against the smooth warmth of his neck. Her heart leapt. She had touched countless horses, but none had ever filled her with this kind of electricity, an almost spiritual connection that hummed through her fingertips. Sam watched in silence, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "He doesn't trust easy," he said at last. "If he lets you near, it means something." Emily smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "Maybe he sees something in me too." But her excitement quickly gave way to determination. "Let me help," she said suddenly. "I can groom him, feed him, even ride him if you'll let me. I want to be part of this." Sam's hand paused mid-brush. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Memories surged unbidden. Matthew, his son, perched proudly on the back of a colt, his laughter ringing in the morning air. Then the scream, the fall, the silence that followed. The wound still burned, even after all these years. "No," Sam said finally, his voice low. "He's not ready. You're not ready." Emily's face fell, but she didn't back down. "How will either of us be ready if you don't let me try?" Her words struck him harder than he expected. She was like her father in that way, stubborn, fiery, unwilling to be caged. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes, and focused again on the stallion. "You can help," he said after a long pause, "but not from the saddle. Not yet." So Emily threw herself into the work. She hauled buckets of water, carried bales of hay, polished tack until her arms ached. Midnight Star grew accustomed to her presence, nickering softly when she approached, lowering his head so she could stroke the white star on his forehead. At night, when the world grew quiet, she would slip out to the barn and whisper to him, telling him stories of her dreams, of the places she longed to see. The stallion would listen, ears twitching, as though he understood every word. One afternoon, when Sam was repairing a broken fence, Emily seized her chance. She climbed onto the lower rail, swung her leg over Midnight Star's back, and settled gently against his bare spine. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The stallion shifted, muscles tightening, and then he exploded into motion. Emily clung desperately to his mane as Midnight Star bolted across the pasture, the wind tearing at her hair, the ground flying beneath them. It was wild and terrifying, but also exhilarating, like being carried by a force greater than herself. She laughed, a sound of pure freedom, even as fear prickled her skin. Sam looked up from the fence, and his blood ran cold. "Emily!" he shouted, dropping his hammer and sprinting toward the field. Midnight Star veered suddenly, and Emily lost her grip. She tumbled to the ground, rolling through the grass before coming to a stop, breath knocked from her lungs. The stallion skidded to a halt, tossing his head wildly, his hooves striking the earth in panic. Sam reached her side in seconds, his heart pounding. "Are you hurt?" Emily gasped, then sat up, her knees scraped, her palms raw, but her eyes, bright, defiant, met his with a fire that startled him. "Did you see?" she whispered, almost breathless. "He carried me. He didn't throw me. He carried me." Sam stared at her, torn between anger and awe. Midnight Star trotted back toward them, his ears flicked forward, his breath heavy. He lowered his head, nudging Emily's shoulder gently, as if to check she was all right. In that instant, Sam saw it. The invisible thread between them, stronger than he had imagined. He had wanted to protect Emily, to shield her from the dangers that had once stolen his son. But maybe, just maybe, this was not about protection. Maybe it was about trust. He helped her to her feet, his voice softer now. "You scared me half to death," he muttered. Emily grinned through the dirt smeared across her cheek. "Then you know how alive it feels." Sam exhaled slowly, glancing at the stallion who stood calm beside them now, his great chest rising and falling in rhythm with their own. The girl and the horse had found each other, and whether he liked it or not, the bond was real. And in that bond, Samuel Walker saw both the danger and the hope of the days to come. The days grew shorter as the sun lingered lower over the Kentucky hills, stretching long shadows across the pasture. Each morning, the mist clung to the fields like a veil, and each evening the cicadas sang as if urging time forward toward the inevitable race. In those days, Samuel Walker pressed Midnight Star harder, testing his speed, his endurance, and above all, his trust. The stallion responded with a fire that startled even Sam, a fire both magnificent and dangerous, like a river swollen with rain that could either nourish the land or sweep it away. Emily remained at his side, her hands blistered from labor and her heart restless from the pull of the unknown. She had tasted the wildness of Midnight Star's back, the rush of wind against her face, and it had ignited something within her that refused to be extinguished. She begged Sam to let her ride again, but each time his answer was the same. A quiet shake of the head, a silence heavy with ghosts. "Patience," he told her. "Trust takes time. He's not just a horse you climb on and master. He's a storm. You don't tame storms, you learn to move with them." Emily bit back her frustration, though it burned her throat. She wanted to prove she was worthy, to prove that she too could hold that invisible bond. So she found her own way. At dawn, while Sam rested on the porch with a cup of black coffee, she slipped into the barn. Midnight Star greeted her with a low nicker, his dark eyes bright in the half-light. She brushed him in silence, spoke to him in whispers about the life she wanted, about the fear that she would never be more than the shadow of her uncle's legacy. The stallion listened, ears twitching, head lowering to her touch, as though he understood every word. It was during one of these stolen mornings that Sam watched unseen from the barn door. He saw the way Midnight Star leaned into Emily's hands, the way the girl's posture shifted from tentative to assured, and for a fleeting second, he saw his son in her. The memory struck him hard, leaving him breathless. He turned away before she could notice, the pain of the past pressing against the fragile hope of the present. But Sam knew the bond between Emily and the stallion could not be ignored. That afternoon, he brought her into the pasture. "If you want to help," he said gruffly, "you'll do it my way." Her eyes lit with triumph, though she kept her smile small, knowing how hard it had been for him to say those words. The training shifted then. Emily became more than a helper. She became a student. Sam taught her how to read the horse's breath, how to sense the slightest flick of an ear, how to stand still when instinct screamed to move. He showed her how trust was not demanded but given, how the wild heart of a horse was like a mirror that reflected the soul of the one who stood before it. There were setbacks, moments when Midnight Star bucked in defiance, when Emily's fear cracked through her determination. Once she fell again, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. Sam rushed to her, anger boiling over. "This isn't a game, Emily. One wrong move and he'll kill you." But Emily pushed herself to her feet, her eyes wet but fierce. "If I'm afraid of falling, I'll never learn to stand. And if I never learn to stand, I'll never be ready to carry what comes after you." Her words silenced him. They cut deeper than she realized, touching the very core of the grief he had carried since Matthew's death. He turned away, fists clenched, torn between the instinct to protect her and the realization that she had already chosen her path. Midnight Star, as though sensing the storm between them, stepped forward and nuzzled Emily's shoulder. His breath was warm against her skin, his body calm despite the tension in the air. Sam looked back and saw the truth. The stallion had accepted her. Whatever fear or doubt lingered in his own heart, the horse had already made his choice. From then on, the three of them trained together, bound by something greater than blood or discipline. Sam guided, Emily learned, and Midnight Star carried them both into a rhythm that felt like destiny taking shape. The stallion's strides grew surer, his fire tempered by focus, his wild heart slowly finding its balance. Still, danger lurked beneath the surface. Each time Midnight Star ran, he seemed to push harder, faster, as though testing the limits of his own body. Sam watched with narrowed eyes, worried that the stallion's passion might burn too hot, too quick. He knew the race would not just be about speed. It would be about control. About who could harness the storm without breaking it. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky in molten gold, Emily stood beside Midnight Star, her hand resting on his neck. "He wants to run more," she said softly. "I can feel it." Sam's gaze lingered on the horizon. "And he will, but not yet. Fire untamed destroys. Fire guided builds." Emily looked at her uncle then, really looked at him. The lines etched into his face, the weight he carried in his silence. And for the first time, she realized that the race was more than a contest for him. It was a reckoning. A chance to reclaim not just his name, but the part of himself he had buried with his son. As the last light faded, Midnight Star lifted his head and snorted, his breath a cloud in the cooling air. His eyes shone like embers, alive with the spirit that could not be contained. Emily shivered, not from the chill, but from the certainty that she stood at the edge of something immense, something that would change all their lives forever. And in that moment, Samuel Walker laid his hand on the stallion's shoulder and whispered words only the horse and the fading night could hear. "Your heart is wild, but together, we'll teach it to fly." The challenge had set Lexington ablaze with anticipation. At every diner counter and roadside bar, voices buzzed about Samuel Walker and Richard Kane, about the impossible race between Midnight Star and Thunderbolt. Some spoke with scorn, certain Sam would be humiliated. Others, quieter but no less passionate, whispered that perhaps the old trainer had something left in him, something that money could never buy. Richard Kane heard it all, and every word gnawed at him. He was used to being adored, to standing in rooms where every nod and every cheer was his by right. But now, in the glow of his mansion's chandeliers, he felt the sting of doubt creeping through the polished walls. Samuel Walker's name had returned from the grave, stirring ghosts that Richard thought long buried, and he hated it. That night, Kane paced in his study, bourbon glass in hand, the fire in the hearth casting restless shadows across his face. Elliot Grant lounged in a leather chair, amused by his friend's agitation. "You're taking this too seriously," Elliot drawled, swirling the liquid in his glass. "It's a circus, nothing more. He's an old man with a lucky bid. Thunderbolt will crush him, and the world will laugh him back into obscurity." Richard stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "I don't like surprises, Elliot. And Walker, he unsettles me. That stunt with the stallion at the auction, letting it loose and having it walk straight to him, that wasn't chance. That was something else." Elliot smirked. "Then make sure chance doesn't play a part. If you're worried, we make certain he never reaches the track." The words hung heavy in the air. Richard's eyes flickered with hesitation, then hardened. "Do what needs to be done. Midnight Star won't make it to Churchill Downs." Later, under the cover of night, two men crept across Sam's pasture. They moved like shadows, carrying rope and wire cutters, their boots silent on the grass. The barn stood dark, the house quiet, the world around them asleep. But inside, Midnight Star stirred, his ears twitching, nostrils flaring as though he sensed the malice on the wind. Emily had fallen asleep in the loft above the stalls, curled under a blanket with hay prickling her skin. She woke to the faint creak of hinges, the smell of sweat unfamiliar to her. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she heard it, the shuffle of feet, the hushed curses of men moving through the barn. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Peering through the slats, she saw them. Strangers approaching Midnight Star's stall, one already raising a rope. Panic flooded her. She scrambled down the ladder, her bare feet hitting the ground hard. "Stop!" she cried, her voice cracking the silence like lightning. The men spun, startled, their faces half hidden in the dim light. "Get her out!" one hissed. Before they could move, Midnight Star reared, slamming his hooves against the wooden door with a force that rattled the barn. His eyes blazed, ears pinned back, body coiled with fury. The men stumbled, fear breaking their confidence. Emily darted to the stall, fumbling with the latch. The door burst open, and Midnight Star surged out, black mane flying, muscles rippling like thunder rolling through the earth. The intruders fled, cursing, vanishing into the night. Sam arrived moments later, rifle in hand, breath ragged from running. He took in the scene, the open stall, the trampled hay, Emily standing wild-eyed beside the stallion who pawed the ground, still trembling with adrenaline. His gaze shifted from her to the darkness beyond the barn. He didn't need to see their faces to know who had sent them. "You shouldn't have been here," he said hoarsely, lowering the rifle. Emily lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the fear that still shook her. "If I hadn't, he'd be gone. You can't fight this alone, Uncle Sam, and neither can he." She stroked Midnight Star's neck, calming him. The stallion lowered his head, leaning into her touch, as though she were the anchor that steadied his storm. Sam's throat tightened. He saw the truth in her words, but admitting it was harder than breathing. He looked at her, her scraped hands, her eyes blazing with defiance, and realized she wasn't a child to be sheltered anymore. She was part of this fight, whether he wanted her to be or not. The next morning, the story of the break-in spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about men seen fleeing through the woods, about the stallion that had defended himself and the girl who had stood her ground. Sam said nothing, but inside his chest the fire burned hotter. Kane had crossed a line. This was no longer just a race, it was war. Emily noticed the change in her uncle. His silence grew heavier, but his actions sharper. He trained Midnight Star with renewed intensity, every movement calculated, every exercise driven with purpose. The stallion responded, his wildness channeling into power, his trust in Sam and Emily deepening with every passing day. At night, Sam stood alone in the barn, watching the stallion sleep. He thought of Kane, of the arrogance in his smile, of the fear he had tried to bury beneath wealth. He whispered into the darkness, "You'll have to do more than send shadows, Richard. We'll be there on that track. And when we are, you'll see what a wild heart can do." Outside, the hills of Kentucky lay still beneath the stars, but in the quiet pasture, destiny stirred. The plot in the shadows had failed, but it had lit a new fire, one that neither Sam, Emily, nor Midnight Star could extinguish. The name Thunderbolt carried a weight of inevitability, a sound that made bookmakers smile and rivals swallow their pride. In the racing world, he was not simply another stallion. He was a phenomenon, a streak of silver lightning on 4 legs. His record was unblemished. Every race won with a margin that crushed both competitors and doubt. To many, he was less a horse and more a force of nature, bred and sculpted by wealth into living perfection. Richard Kane knew this, and wore the horse's reputation like a crown. When he brought guests to his estate, he paraded Thunderbolt under the glare of floodlights, the stallion's gray coat shining like polished steel. Trainers and stable hands hovered in silence, their movements precise, reverent, as though serving a king. Richard relished these displays. Every time Thunderbolt's hooves struck the dirt with flawless rhythm, it was as if the world itself confirmed Kane's power. One evening, as twilight sank into velvet, Richard stood at the edge of his private track, his hands clasped behind his back. Thunderbolt thundered past, muscles flexing, mane streaming in the wind. His speed seemed unreal, almost terrifying in its certainty. Elliot Grant, leaning lazily against the rail with a glass of bourbon, laughed over the roar of hooves. "Look at him," Elliot said. "That horse isn't running, he's flying. If Walker thinks he can compete with that relic from the auction, he's more delusional than I thought." Richard didn't respond immediately. He watched the stallion round the bend and accelerate as though fueled by some inexhaustible fire. When Thunderbolt crossed the finish, the stopwatch confirmed it. Another record shattered in practice. Richard allowed himself a smile, sharp and satisfied. "He doesn't stand a chance," Richard finally said, his voice calm but edged with venom. "Walker thinks this is a fairy tale. that heart and trust can topple power. But power is what wins. Money, bloodlines, precision. Walker is clinging to ghosts, and ghosts don't win races. Yet even as he said it, a flicker of unease lingered. The memory of Midnight Star stepping calmly toward Sam at the auction still gnawed at him. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing but theatrics, a trick of timing and luck. Still, he increased Thunderbolt's training schedule, pushing the stallion harder, demanding more speed, more perfection, as though trying to outrun his own doubt. The stable hands whispered among themselves. They adored Thunderbolt, but they feared Kane's obsession. The stallion was already a champion, already untouchable, yet Richard treated every stride as if it were not enough. "He'll burn him out," one muttered, as Thunderbolt was led back to his stall, sweat streaming down his silver flanks. Even lightning can't strike forever. Meanwhile, in the quiet pastures of Sam's farm, Emily listened to the rumors with growing apprehension. She heard of Thunderbolt's victories, of the flawless times that sent shockwaves through the racing world. One evening, as she brushed Midnight Star's coat, she bit her lip and asked, "Do you think we really can beat him?" Sam didn't answer right away. He stood near the barn door, gazing into the fading light where the stallion's breath rose in slow, steady clouds. At last, he said, "We're not racing Thunderbolt. We're racing ourselves. If we run with everything we've got, then no matter the outcome, we'll have already won." Emily frowned. "That sounds like something you say when you're not sure." Sam looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "I'm sure of one thing. Thunderbolt has power. Midnight Star has heart. And in the end, it's heart that carries you when power runs dry." Midnight Star flicked his ears, shifting closer to Emily as if to prove the point. She smiled faintly, pressing her forehead to his neck. The stallion's warmth comforted her, but in the depths of her chest, anxiety still stirred. Word of Thunderbolt's dominance reached even the smallest corners of Kentucky. Bettors placed their money without hesitation, certain Kane's stallion would extend his perfect record. Newspapers printed photographs of the sleek gray champion, headlines crowning him the inevitable victor. Samuel Walker's name was mentioned only as a curiosity, a footnote to Kane's grandeur. But in the barns, among the stable hands and trainers who had spent their lives with horses, a different story circulated. They spoke of the way Walker touched his stallion, the quiet patience in his hands, the strange calm that Midnight Star seemed to exude in his presence. "That's not training," one old hand said with a shake of his head. "That's something else. You can't measure it in times or trophies." Back at Kane's estate, Elliot poured himself another drink, watching Richard watch his horse. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? The whole state watching, waiting. It's a spectacle. Win or lose, you're still the center of it all." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I don't just want to win, Elliot. I want to destroy him. I want Walker to regret ever stepping foot in that auction. When Thunderbolt crosses that line, it won't just be a victory. It'll be a burial." Thunderbolt snorted in his stall, pawing the ground as though he understood. His breath steamed in the lamplight, his body taut with energy that seemed too much for his skin to contain. He was undefeated, unstoppable, a living weapon forged for this very moment. But somewhere beyond the reach of marble walls and crystal glasses, another stallion pawed the ground beneath a humble barn roof, his dark eyes burning with something less visible, but no less powerful. Midnight Star's heart beat in rhythm with Samuel Walker's. And though the world crowned Thunderbolt the inevitable victor, fate had yet to write its final line. The autumn wind swept across the pasture with a mournful sound, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Samuel Walker stood by the fence, his weathered hands gripping the wood as he watched Midnight Star gallop freely across the field. The stallion's black coat shone with sweat, his breath visible in white plumes. Every stride was a reminder of raw power, yet also of fragility, because Sam knew how quickly glory could be broken. That knowledge was a scar carved deep into his heart, one he carried silently through the years. It was the wound that had driven him away from the tracks, away from the world of winners and wagers, and into a silence he had never escaped. Emily approached quietly, her boots soft in the damp grass. She had seen the shadow in her uncle's eyes, the way his voice grew heavy whenever the subject of the past surfaced. Tonight, the air felt different, like the earth itself was waiting for something to be said. She rested her hands on the fence beside him, her gaze following the stallion's steady rhythm. "You've never told me why you left," she said softly. "Everyone talks about how you just disappeared. One day, you were a legend. The next, gone." Sam didn't answer at first. He tilted his hat lower, as though trying to shield himself from a memory that had burned too bright. But Emily's voice pressed gently, like a hand on an old bruise. "I need to know, Uncle Sam. If I'm part of this, if Midnight Star is part of this, I need to understand what we're fighting against." The silence stretched, broken only by the thud of hooves and the whistle of wind. Finally, Sam spoke, his words slow, rough as gravel. "It was my boy," he said. "Matthew." Emily's breath caught. She had known her father only through fading photographs and the stories others whispered, but never had her uncle spoken his name with such naked pain. She turned toward him, her throat tight, waiting. Sam's hands tightened on the fence. His eyes, usually steady as stone, shimmered with something raw. "He wanted to be like me, more than anything. He was fearless, reckless even, but he had the fire. I thought I could guide him, teach him how to carry it. One morning he saddled a colt I'd been training. Too young, too wild. I told him to wait. He didn't listen." Sam's voice cracked, but he forced himself onward. "I saw it happen. I was right there, the horse spooked. Matthew held on, but not long enough. He fell. His neck," he stopped, his breath shaking, his words unraveling into silence. Emily's eyes blurred with tears. She had always known her father had died young. But the truth, the image of that moment, was a wound she felt now, as if it had cut her too. Sam finally turned to her, his face carved with grief that had never faded. "That day, I walked away from it all, from racing, from training, from the life I'd built. I buried everything with him." The confession hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Emily reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "But you didn't bury yourself, Uncle. You're still here. And maybe this is your way back. Maybe Midnight Star is your second chance." Sam looked at her, at the fire in her young eyes, so much like Matthew's had been. For years he had tried to shield her from that fire, afraid it would consume her the same way it had consumed his son. But here she stood, unafraid, ready to carry the burden with him. Midnight Star slowed his run, trotting toward them, ears flicking, nostrils flaring as if he had felt the weight of their grief and come to stand witness. Emily stepped forward, stroking the stallion's muzzle. "He knows," she whispered. "He feels it too." Sam swallowed hard, laying a hand on the horse's neck. The warmth beneath his palm grounded him, reminded him that life still surged forward no matter how many shadows lingered. "Maybe so," he murmured. "Maybe that's why he's here." That night, Emily lay awake in the loft above the barn, staring into the darkness. The story of her father replayed in her mind, but instead of fear, she felt a strange clarity. She understood now why Sam carried his silence, why he feared letting her too close. But she also knew something he didn't. The bond between them, between her and Midnight Star, was not a curse. It was a gift, a thread that tied past pain to future hope. Down below, Sam sat on a stool beside the stall, his rifle propped nearby, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Midnight Star stood calm, his breaths deep and steady. Sam whispered into the stillness, words meant more for himself than for the horse. "I couldn't save Matthew, but maybe I can save myself." The barn creaked with the night wind, the sound like an old hymn carried on the rafters. Outside, the hills lay cloaked in darkness, yet a sliver of moonlight cut through, falling across Sam's face. The old wound still ached, but for the first time in years, it no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a scar, painful, yes, but healed enough to carry forward. And in that fragile moment, Samuel Walker realized that the race ahead was not just about Thunderbolt or Richard Kane. It was about Matthew. It was about Emily. It was about proving that even wounds that once destroyed a man could become the reason he rose again. The week slipped by like water through calloused hands, each sunrise and sunset carrying Samuel Walker closer to the day of reckoning. The hills of Kentucky, dressed in late autumn gold, seemed to hold their breath. Every crow that lifted from the fields, every gust of wind that rattled through the sycamores, reminded him that time was running short. And so he trained with a relentless steadiness, pouring every ounce of knowledge, patience, and heart into the black stallion who had chosen him. Midnight Star grew stronger with each passing day. His wild fire, once untamed, had begun to take shape under Sam's guidance. He was no longer a storm lashing against the world, but a river of power channeled with purpose. Yet Sam knew instinctively that there was one step left to take, one barrier they had to cross before he could believe the horse was ready for Thunderbolt. It was the test of absolute trust, the kind that could not be faked, could not be forced. Emily sensed the tension in her uncle long before he spoke of it. She watched him drive the stallion harder, then pull back, his eyes calculating, his silence weighing heavier than usual. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of fire and blood, she found him standing by the pasture gate, staring at Midnight Star grazing in the fading light. "What's missing?" she asked quietly. Sam didn't turn. His voice was low, heavy with thought. Control. Trust. The kind that doesn't need a rope, doesn't need reins. The kind that comes when horse and rider stop being two and become one. Emily's eyes widened, her heart quickening. She had seen flashes of that bond between them, had felt its echo when the stallion leaned into her hand. But what Sam spoke of was something deeper, something almost impossible. "How do you test something like that?" she asked. Sam's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. "By letting go." The next morning, he led Midnight Star into the open field at the far edge of the farm. The grass stretched wide, the ground smooth and firm, the sky above pale with the promise of winter. Emily followed, her breath catching when she saw what he carried. Not a saddle, not reins, not even a bridle. Just a lead rope coiled loosely in his hand. "You're not," she began, but the words stuck in her throat. Sam looked at her, his gray eyes calm but unwavering. "If he's ready, if I'm ready, this will tell us. If not," he left the sentence unfinished. With a steady breath, he unhooked the rope, letting it fall away. Midnight Star stood free, his ears flicking, his dark eyes bright with curiosity. For a heartbeat, the stallion lifted his head, nostrils flaring, the taste of freedom sharp in the air. Emily's pulse raced. She remembered the night the horse had bolted into the woods, remembered the panic that had clawed at her chest. What if he ran again? What if he didn't come back? But Sam stepped forward, no fear in his movements, only quiet certainty. He whispered something low, words too soft for Emily to hear. Midnight Star's ears twitched, his muscles rippling as though he were weighing a choice. Then, with deliberate grace, he lowered his head and stepped closer, brushing against Sam's shoulder. Sam placed a hand on the stallion's neck, then pulled away, turning his back. He began to walk. For a long, breathless moment, Midnight Star stood still. Then, without a word, he followed. Step for step, breath for breath, his body moved in rhythm with the man before him. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It was like watching two halves of the same spirit, one guiding, the other answering. No reins, no commands, only trust. Sam stopped, turned, and Midnight Star mirrored him perfectly. He shifted his weight, and the stallion responded as if tethered by an invisible line. At last, Sam broke into a run, and Midnight Star surged forward beside him. Not ahead, not behind, but alongside, their strides matching like a single heartbeat. When they slowed, Sam placed his hand against the stallion's muzzle, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a prayer no one else could hear. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from awe. She had doubted, feared, but now she understood. Midnight Star was ready. They were ready. Sam looked at her then, his face lined but alight with something she had not seen in years. "This," he said simply, "is what Thunderbolt doesn't have. Money can buy speed, training can polish skill, but this," he gestured between himself and the horse, "this can't be bought. This is earned." Emily ran forward, throwing her arms around him, her cheek pressed against his chest. "You're going to win," she whispered fiercely. "I know it now. You're going to win." Sam held her close, his throat tight. He wished he could promise her victory, wished he could erase the fear that lingered in his own heart. But he knew better than anyone that races were unpredictable, that even the strongest bond could be tested by fate. Still, he allowed himself to believe, just for that moment, that they had a chance. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Sam sat outside the barn with Midnight Star beside him. The stallion grazed quietly, occasionally lifting his head to nudge Sam's shoulder. The old trainer stroked his mane, his voice low. "We're ready, boy. Tomorrow we face them. Tomorrow we show them what heart looks like." And deep inside, beneath the scars of the past, Samuel Walker felt something stir that he had thought was lost forever. Hope. The morning before the race broke cold and brittle, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Lexington stirred earlier than usual, as though the entire town had been awakened by the same restless dream. Everywhere Sam Walker's name was whispered, on street corners, in diners, outside betting parlors where men and women lined up to place their wagers. The odds were stacked heavily in Richard Kane's favor. And yet, for the first time in years, Samuel Walker's name shared space in the headlines with words like hope and miracle. At the farm, Sam rose before the sun. He walked to the barn in silence, his boots crunching frost off the grass. Midnight Star greeted him with a soft snort, ears flicking forward. The stallion's breath curled into the chill, his dark eyes watchful, as if he knew what awaited them. Sam laid his hand against the horse's muzzle and whispered, "We're almost there, boy. One more day." Emily appeared soon after, wrapped in a heavy coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down beside him. "The whole county's talking about you," she said, a nervous laugh in her voice. "Some say you're crazy. Some say you're the only one who could ever beat Kane." Sam lifted the mug but didn't drink. "Doesn't matter what they say. Tomorrow it'll be just us and them on that track." Emily hesitated, then sat beside him on the hay bale. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not because I don't believe in you. I do. But because I know how much this means. To you, to Midnight Star. And if it doesn't go the way we want..." She trailed off, unable to finish. Sam turned to her, his eyes softer than his voice. "Fear's not weakness, Emily. It's the price of caring. If you're not afraid of losing, it means it didn't matter enough in the first place." She swallowed hard, then nodded. His words steadied her, though they couldn't erase the dread gnawing in her stomach. By afternoon, the farm was no longer quiet. Cars pulled up along the road, strangers leaning against fences to catch a glimpse of the horse they had heard so much about. Some brought cameras, snapping photos as though trying to capture a piece of history. Sam ignored them all, focusing on Midnight Star's exercises. Every move was measured, controlled. Not too much, not too little. He refused to risk the stallion's strength on the eve of the race. Inside the city, Richard Kane orchestrated his own spectacle. Reporters swarmed the gates of his estate, their lenses hungry for shots of thunderbolt. The gray stallion looked carved from stone, his coat gleaming, his hooves polished to black mirrors. He trotted with perfect discipline, his every stride a declaration of inevitability. Richard basked in the attention, declaring confidently to the cameras, "Tomorrow you'll see the difference between sentiment and strength. Walker's time has passed. Thunderbolt is the future." That evening, the atmosphere shifted. At Churchill Downs, lanterns were lit early, illuminating the track where tomorrow's race would be decided. Trainers checked their stalls, officials prepared the grounds, and in the grandstands workers polished every rail for the spectacle to come in. The track itself lay quiet under the glow, waiting, like a stage before the curtain rises. Sam walked Midnight Star along the fence line, Emily trailing a step behind. The stallion's ears flicked toward the distant sounds, alert but calm. Sam ran his hand down the horse's neck, feeling the steady beat beneath the skin. "Hear that?" he murmured. "That's the world waiting for us. But we don't run for them. We run for us." Emily watched her uncle, her chest tightening. She had never seen him so steady, so resolved. The weight of the past seemed to have lifted from his shoulders, leaving behind only purpose. For the first time, she believed not just in the possibility of victory, but in the inevitability of it. Night fell heavy and still. In the farmhouse, Emily sat by the window, staring at the glow of the city beyond the hills. She thought of her father, of the story her uncle had told her, of the wound that had nearly destroyed him, and she realized now that tomorrow was not just a race. It was the moment where grief and redemption would collide, where Midnight Star would carry more than a rider. He would carry the weight of a man's second chance. In the barn, Sam lay on a cot near the stall, refusing to leave the stallion's side. Midnight Star stood quiet, occasionally shifting, his breath slow and steady. Sam watched him for a long time, eyes heavy with fatigue, but refusing to close. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tomorrow, we prove it wasn't all for nothing." And as the wind swept over the Kentucky hills, rattling the last of the autumn leaves, the world seemed to pause. The day of the race loomed just beyond the horizon, and in its shadow, both victory and heartbreak waited to claim their place. The day of the race dawned beneath a sky heavy with clouds, as though the heavens themselves understood the weight of what was about to unfold. By mid-morning, Churchill Downs was alive with noise and motion. Carriages and sleek automobiles clogged the grand entrance, their polished chrome glinting. Wealthy breeders in tailored coats mingled with working-class horsemen who had scraped together enough to buy a ticket, all drawn by the same irresistible promise: to witness a contest that had already begun to taste like legend. Vendors hawked bourbon and roasted peanuts, the smells mixing with the pungent tang of manure and liniment. The grandstands swelled with bodies, a living tide of expectation. Above it all, the great oval of the racetrack stretched out, silent and waiting, its dirt surface smooth and damp from the night's mist. The stage was set. In the stables, Thunderbolt was being readied like a king about to march into battle. The gray stallion's coat gleamed with a silvery sheen, brushed until it seemed to hold its own light. His breath rose in great clouds as the stable hands tightened the saddle straps, their movements crisp and efficient. Every muscle in the stallion's body coiled with contained power, his hooves striking the ground with impatience. Richard Kane stood nearby, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his eyes hard and hungry. "Today," he said to no one in particular, "the name Walker is buried for good." Elliot Grant, sipping from a silver flask, grinned. "And Thunderbolt becomes not just undefeated, but untouchable." When the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, listing the competitors, the crowd roared with approval at the mention of Kane's champion. Thunderbolt was not just a horse. He was a certainty, the embodiment of money's promise. His very name sent shivers of admiration through the grandstand. Yet when Samuel Walker led Midnight Star into the paddock, the mood shifted. The black stallion stepped calmly, his ears flicking, his eyes steady as they scanned the restless sea of faces. He was not polished to gleam like his rival, nor did he prance with arrogance. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet gravity that drew whispers from the crowd. Some jeered, mocking the shabby coat Sam wore, the battered hat pulled low, but others fell silent, unsettled by the way the stallion moved beside the man, as if tethered not by rope, but by will. Emily walked with them until the gate, her face pale, but her eyes burning. She touched Midnight Star's neck, her voice trembling but firm. "Remember, he runs for you, not for them." Sam gave her a single nod, mounting the stallion with slow precision. From the grandstand, Richard watched with a smirk that didn't quite hide the edge in his jaw. The gates opened. Horses filed into the starting area, snorting, pawing at the dirt. The announcer's voice boomed again, rising above the thunder of hooves. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves. Today we witness Samuel Walker, once a legend of the track, returning with his Midnight Star to face Richard Kane's undefeated champion, Thunderbolt. The cheer that followed was deafening, a tide of sound that seemed to shake the very rails. Inside the gate, Thunderbolt reared, his muscles rippling like a storm contained in flesh. The crowd gasped, awed by his ferocity. He looked every bit his name, lightning and thunder wrapped in silver hide. Sam glanced across at him, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Midnight Star stood still, ears pricked, his breathing steady, as though waiting for a cue only Sam could give. Richard caught Sam's eye and leaned forward in his saddle, his smirk wide and cruel. "You'll regret this, old man," he called over the noise. Sam's reply was quiet, meant only for his horse. "Steady, boy. Our race is with ourselves." The crowd hushed as the starter raised the flag. A heartbeat of silence. Then the crack of the pistol split the air. The gates burst open, and Thunderbolt shot forward like a bolt of silver fire. The ground shook under his hooves, dirt spraying as he surged ahead with terrifying speed. The grandstands erupted, a roar of triumph already building in their throats. This was what they expected. Thunderbolt dominating from the first stride. Midnight Star broke clean but slower, his strides measured, his pace steady. Sam held him back deliberately, his hands light, his voice low in the horse's ear. "Not yet," he murmured. "Wait for it." By the first turn, Thunderbolt had carved a lead, his legs churning, his power undeniable. Richard glanced back over his shoulder, grinning, already tasting victory. To the crowd, it looked like the race was over before it had truly begun. But in the stands, a few old trainers leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. They saw the way Sam sat in the saddle, calm as stone, the way Midnight Star's strides were smooth and even, conserving energy while his rival burned bright and fast. The storm of Thunderbolt raged on, but Samuel Walker knew storms spent themselves quickly. He could feel the rhythm of Midnight Star. Beneath him, the wild heart that had learned to trust, the fire tempered into focus. And as the crowd screamed for Thunderbolt, Sam whispered into the rushing wind, "Now let's show them what we are." Thunderbolt tore across the track like a tempest unleashed, his stride so powerful that the very earth seemed to tremble beneath him. The crowd thundered in unison, their cheers rising higher with every length he gained. Cameras flashed, voices roared, and the name Kane was already being shouted in celebration. From the grandstands to the betting halls, the story seemed written. Richard Kane's champion was unstoppable. But Samuel Walker knew better. He sat low in the saddle, his body moving fluidly with Midnight Star's controlled rhythm. His hands rested light on the reins, not pulling, not forcing, only guiding. "Steady, boy," he murmured into the wind. The black stallion's ears flicked, his breath strong and even. They were not racing the crowd, nor the odds, nor even Thunderbolt. They were waiting for the moment when heart would matter more than speed. By the halfway mark, Thunderbolt still dominated. His gray coat shimmered with sweat, mane whipping like silver fire, hooves pounding in relentless cadence. Richard leaned forward, grinning, every fiber of him certain the race was his. He glanced back once, just long enough to see Midnight Star several lengths behind, and he laughed aloud. "Stay there, old man," he muttered under his breath. Emily, watching from the rail, clutched the wood until her knuckles turned white. Her breath caught with every stride, her eyes fixed on Midnight Star. She could see what the crowd could not. That Sam was holding the stallion back. That the black horse's strides were not labored, but measured, as if saving his fire for the moment of truth. "Come on," she whispered fiercely. "Show them." As they rounded the second bend, Richard urged Thunderbolt harder. The stallion responded with another burst of speed, but there was a shift. Subtle at first. His strides grew sharper, more frantic, his breathing heavier. He had given so much in the early surge, and though his power was immense, it was not endless. Sam felt the change in the air. He leaned closer to Midnight Star's ear, his voice a whisper swallowed by the roar of the crowd. "Now," the stallion answered. Midnight Star surged forward with a suddenness that startled even Sam, his muscles coiling and releasing with perfect precision. His strides lengthened, smooth and powerful, eating away at the ground between him and Thunderbolt. The black coat shimmered under the stadium lights, his mane whipping like a banner of defiance. The crowd gasped as the gap narrowed, first by inches, then by yards. Richard looked back again, and this time his grin faltered. Midnight Star was coming, his strides relentless, his body fueled not by discipline alone, but by something deeper. Trust, fire, and the invisible bond that tied him to the man on his back. Richard shouted, driving Thunderbolt harder, but the gray stallion's chest heaved, his power beginning to splinter under the strain. The grandstand erupted into chaos. Some screamed Kane's name, others shouted Walker's, their voices colliding into a storm of disbelief and exhilaration. Emily's eyes filled with tears as Midnight Star drew level, his black flank brushing against Thunderbolt's silver side. For one heart-stopping moment, the two stallions ran neck and neck, lightning and shadow locked in perfect symmetry. Sam leaned lower, his voice calm but fierce. "You've got more, boy. Show them who you are." And Midnight Star answered again. With a roar of muscle and will, he surged past Thunderbolt, his strides clean and fluid where his rivals faltered. The crowd rose to their feet, a wall of sound crashing down around the track. Cameras flashed, capturing the impossible moment, the black stallion overtaking the undefeated champion, the forgotten man reclaiming his place among legends. Richard's fury twisted into desperation. He yanked at the reins, shouted at Thunderbolt, begged for more speed. The gray horse strained, his body giving everything it had left, but the storm that had seemed unstoppable was breaking apart under its own weight. For every desperate stride Thunderbolt managed, Midnight Star answered with strength, with grace, with heart. The final stretch loomed ahead, the white line gleaming beneath the floodlight. Sam's entire body moved with the stallion, every breath, every shift in weight a silent conversation. He could feel Matthew in this moment, his son's spirit carried forward in Emily's fire, in the stallion's heart, in his own refusal to yield. It was no longer just a race. It was redemption. "Fly," Sam whispered. Midnight Star responded with one last surge, his hooves striking like drums of victory. The ground blurred beneath them, the roar of the crowd fading into white noise. The stallion stretched, his body extending into the air as though wings had unfurled from his back. They crossed the finish line. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed suspended, breathless. Then the announcer's voice cracked through the air, struggling to rise above the chaos. "And the winner, Midnight Star, Samuel Walker and Midnight Star." The grandstands exploded into sound. Some screamed in disbelief, others in joy, but none could deny what they had witnessed. The forgotten man and his dark stallion had toppled the king. Richard pulled Thunderbolt to a halt, his face pale, his chest heaving with rage and shock. Elliot's flask slipped from his hand in the stands, his smirk gone, his mouth open in disbelief. Emily wept openly, her voice lost in the roar as she clutched the rail, whispering, "You did it. You really did it." Sam slowed Midnight Star to a canter, his hand resting against the horse's neck, feeling the heat of victory radiate through his skin. The stallion tossed his head, breath coming hard but steady, eyes bright with the knowledge of what he had accomplished. Together, they had risen, not through wealth or pedigree, but through heart. And in that moment, Samuel Walker knew the past no longer held him captive. The wild heart of his stallion had carried him beyond grief, beyond doubt, into a future that was his to claim once more. For a long moment after the finish line, the track seemed to hold its breath. Midnight Star slowed beneath Samuel Walker, the stallion's chest heaving, steam rising from his coat like smoke from a forge. His ears flicked back, then forward, alert and steady, as though he knew that what he had just done could not be undone. The grandstands, frozen in disbelief, suddenly erupted into an uproar that shook the rafters. It was not just cheering, it was awe, confusion, outrage, jubilation, all colliding into a storm of sound. Emily ran down from the rail, tears streaming, her voice breaking as she called his name. She reached the track's edge, her hands trembling against the fence as she watched her uncle guide the stallion in a slow circle. Sam tipped his battered hat toward her, a gesture so simple yet heavy with meaning, and she knew then that the boy she had never met, her father, was riding there too, carried in every stride. The announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, against every odd, against every expectation, Samuel Walker and Midnight Star have defeated Richard Kane's Thunderbolt." The words rolled through the stands like thunder, igniting another wave of gasps and shouts. Richard pulled Thunderbolt to a halt several yards behind, his jaw clenched so tight the veins stood out in his neck. The stallion, lathered and trembling, had given everything, but it had not been enough. Richard's face was pale, his smirk gone, replaced by a hollowness that even victory's wealth could not disguise. Elliot Grant, usually quick with a cruel remark, stood in the shadows of the owner's box, silent for once, his drink forgotten in his hand. Sam dismounted slowly, his boots touching the dirt with a soft thud. He ran his hand down Midnight Star's neck, whispering words that no one else could hear. The stallion lowered his head, eyes half-lidded, as if bowing not to the crowd but to the man who had believed in him when no one else did. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, voices clashing in a frenzy of questions. "How did you do it? Was it luck? Do you plan to race again?" Sam ignored them all. His eyes found Emily, who pushed her way through the throng, her cheeks streaked with dust and tears. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his waist, clinging to him with all the strength in her small frame. "You did it," she whispered fiercely, her voice shaking. "You brought him back. You brought yourself back." Sam held her tightly, his throat too thick for words. He looked down at her, then at the stallion standing tall beside them, and felt the scar of his old wound ease in a way he had thought impossible. The grief of Matthew's loss would never vanish, but in this moment it had transformed. Not into pain, but into purpose. A hush fell when a young stable hand stepped hesitantly from the edge of the crowd. He couldn't have been more than 14, his cap pulled low, his eyes wide with awe. He clutched the rail with trembling fingers and blurted, "Mr. Walker, how did you know he could win?" Sam studied the boy, seeing the same hunger, the same spark that had once lived in his own son's eyes. Slowly, he smiled, though it was faint and weary. "It ain't just about speed," he said, his voice carrying over the quieted crowd. "It's about heart. A horse can have the best bloodline in the world, but without heart, he's just another animal running in circles. Same goes for a trainer. Heart's what carries you when nothing else will." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing every word. And in that nod, Sam saw the first flicker of legacy, the torch being passed, not by blood, but by belief. Richard Kane strode forward then, his boots crunching in the dirt, his face storm dark. He stopped a few feet away, his voice tight. "This isn't over, Walker. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed Thunderbolt. You think one race changes everything?" Sam turned, calm and unflinching. His eyes, lined with years of loss and wisdom, met Richard's fury with quiet steel. "It changes enough," he said, "because for the first time you saw what money can't buy, and that'll stay with you longer than any loss." Richard's lips curled, but no words came. He pulled sharply at Thunderbolt's reins and stalked away, his shadow shrinking into the chaos of the dispersing crowd. As the evening sun dipped low, casting the track in a golden glow, Sam led Midnight Star back toward the barn. The stallion walked tall, his head high, his stride proud but not arrogant. Emily walked beside them, her hand brushing the horse's flank, her smile radiant with hope. Around them, whispers still rippled through the spectators, some in disbelief, some in reverence, but Sam heard none of it. At the barn, he stopped, resting his hand one final time against Midnight Star's neck. "You did good, boy," he murmured, his voice thick. "Better than good. You gave me back my life." Emily leaned against the stall door, her eyes shining. "And you gave him his." For a long moment, the three stood together in silence. The old trainer, the young girl, and the stallion whose wild heart had become their bond. The world outside might remember the victory, might argue and gamble and gossip about how it had happened. But here, in the quiet hum of the barn, it was something simpler, purer. A man finding his redemption, a girl finding her courage, and a horse finding his place in history. As the last light of day slipped beyond the Kentucky hills, Samuel, Walker tipped his hat, turned toward the open night, and walked out knowing he no longer belonged to the past. He belonged to the future he had just forged, with Emily, with Midnight Star, and with the truth he had proven to the world. Greatness is not bought. It is earned. And in that truth, his legacy was reborn. And now it's your turn. Did you believe Midnight Star could really win? Or did the ending take you by surprise? Drop a simple 0 if you thought he would lose, or a 1 if you believed in his heart from the start. Don't forget to subscribe, because more powerful stories like this one are coming. Stories that will move you, surprise you, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark.